let's run through some additional features of the math tests so that you can clear them away now. You don't have to read them or deal with them later, in addition to giving you some tips on grid-ins and some tips on some other aspects to this test. So first, let's begin by reading the instructions so that we never have to do it again. So let's read this together and then I'll give you some comments. For questions 1 to 15, this one is for section 3, by the way, this one's for section 4. For questions 1 to 15, solve each problem, choose the best answer from the choices provided, and fill in the corresponding circle on your answer sheet. For questions 16 to 20, solve the problem and enter your answer in the grid on the answer sheet. Please refer to the directions before question 16 on how to enter your answers in the grid. You may use any available space in your test booklet for scratch work. So pretty clear stuff there. It's just telling you that you've got multiple choice, you've got grid-in questions. You can write anywhere in the book, and I highly recommend to write all over the place, and we'll talk about this later. But you can write in the book. They're not going to check your book for answers or anything. So make sure your answers are on the bubble sheets as appropriate. And otherwise, pretty straightforward. The only difference with section 4 is the numbering of the questions, but otherwise the instructions are the same. What about these notes? So in this section, the use of a calculator is not permitted. Obviously in section 4, calculator is permitted. All variables and expressions used represent real numbers unless otherwise indicated. That is not something that's really going to affect you in any kind of material way. It's just something that they kind of have to get out of the way. Don't worry about it too. Figures provided in this test are drawn to scale unless otherwise indicated. This is actually important to know. So if they draw a geometric figure or any figure and they don't write anything beneath it about its scale, you can assume it's to scale. So you could take a look at it and determine, okay, this side looks longer. Like if you had a triangle like this and it was to scale, you can assume that this big side is bigger than this small side just because it looks like it. However, if they have something like this where they draw a picture for you and they say figure not drawn to scale, you cannot make any judgments on relative sizes of things based on this picture. So for example, you might look at this and say, okay, X is probably going to be something around, I don't know, 45 or 50, but that's a judgment based on the size of the picture, which we can't trust because the figure's not drawn to scale. It could turn out that X is like 180 or something, which of course wouldn't make sense based on the picture, but that's the whole point. So whenever you see this, just be very careful with your diagram. Make sure you use the information given in the text, often to draw your own diagram, and that's what you should do instead of trusting this at all. That said, even if it didn't say figure not drawn to scale, you still can't make judgments like, oh, okay, here's a triangle. Figure's drawn to scale. It looks like a right triangle, so I'm going to call it a right triangle. Well, you can't make that judgment because maybe it ends up being, 89.9 or something. So even when figure's drawn to scale, your judgments are limited. You should still rely on the information in the text. All figures lie in a plane unless otherwise indicated. Just like number 2, it's kind of irrelevant to us. And then same thing with number 5. Unless otherwise indicated, the domain of a given function f is the set of all real numbers, x for which f of x is a real number. Again, just kind of clearing away some issues, not really something we need to worry about, doesn't affect us. Really, 1 and 3 are the most important ones, and the notes for section 4 are the same for section 3, of course, except for number 1. At the beginning of each math section, you'll be given some reference information, some formulas, basically all for algebra, for geometry, areas, some volumes, some stuff about degrees and angles. We will talk about this later when we go through the lecture videos, but it's good to know that it's in the front. To be honest, though, if you're referring to the reference table too often, that's probably not a good thing. So even though you don't need to memorize these, I do think it's important to have a lot of these committed to memory just because it saves you time, it makes you more efficient. You don't have to keep flipping back and forth. You know what kinds of things are being tested. So I do recommend learning these, but if you do forget them or need to refresh your memory, they are there. Here are the directions for gridding in. You can read this on your own. I'm just going to give you highlights about how this works. So let's say you get as an answer to a question 36. You can go ahead and write 36 in your boxes up here, and then you're going to go ahead and grid or bubble in the numbers or symbols that are appropriate given the numbers you wrote there. Now, the actual thing they grade is this. This doesn't actually matter. So if you put 36 in here and you put in 35 accidentally, you're wrong because you put in 35. If you put 35 here and you actually meant to do 36 and you grid in 36 and 36 is the right answer, you're correct because they don't grade this at all. It's just really a handy tool to help you not make mistakes in theory. If you have something like 36, you can grid it in anywhere. You can put it there, you can put it there, you can put it there. It doesn't really matter. Let's see what else we've got here. You can't mark more than one circle in a column, obviously. You will never get negative answers because you can never grid in a negative answer here. In fact, anything with pi's, anything with square roots are unlikely. While you can, in theory, turn those into decimals, and then you could grid in a decimal, it's just not what the SAT does. So if you find yourself getting 3 pi as an answer, there's a really good chance you made a mistake. If you get 6 square root of 3, again, big chance you made a mistake on the grid-ins. And if you got a negative, you absolutely made a mistake because you can't grid in a negative. So you can use that to your advantage when you're doing these questions. If there are questions that have more than one answer, you just pick one. So if it's anything between 6 and 10, just pick one of those and grid that one answer in. Fractions versus decimals. So for fractions, if you have something like, let's say, 1/2, you can grid in 1/2. That's fine. If you get something like 2/4, you can actually grid in 2/4, and that would be correct. You don't have to reduce it, though I do recommend reducing your answer. If you get something like 3.5, which is a mixed number, you actually can't grid in mixed numbers here because this actually would be grid in as 31/2, not 3/2. So what you would have to do is turn this into either an improper fraction, so grid in 7/2, or you could grid in the decimal version, which would be 3.5. When it comes to decimals, I actually recommend gridding in fractions because if you get something like 1/9, that's 0.11 repeating, it might be a bit confusing about what you do with the decimal. So it's just easier to deal with 1/9. But if you have a decimal, the rule is it has to fill, if it's repeating or goes on forever, you have to fill up all the boxes. So if you got 0.11 repeating, you would have to grid in 0.111. Simply doing 0.11 or 0.1 would be wrong. So you can see where it gets a little bit confusing. Let's say you got 2/3. You could grid in 2/3, which is what I recommend, or this is the same thing as 0.66 repeating. You could actually grid in 0.66 or 0.67. So you can round or what's called truncate, just slice it off. 0.66 or 0.67 would be wrong because you got to fill that up all the way. If you got a decimal like 0.5, of course, you would just get 0.5 and you're done. You don't have to fill it up with zeros or anything like that. But you can see where the decimals get a bit confusing, which is why when you can, going to a fraction, either an improper fraction or just a regular simple fraction, I think is much easier to deal with. And that's basically it for our columns here, for our rules. So go ahead and practice that out. Just make sure you're comfortable doing that before test day because it does take a little bit of time to grid in your answers. So you want to make sure that you're comfortable doing that.